Good morning, everyone. I'm Santa Clara County Supervisor Joe Simitian, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this fourth annual Privacy Office event. We are pleased to have you with us. I want to take a moment just to tee up two observations, if I may, before we get to the heart of the program. The first is to say thank you to our outgoing Chief Privacy Officer, Mike Shapiro. When I came back to the Board of Supervisors, 9 years ago now, I set about the business of trying to ensure that our county was at the top of its game when it came to matters involving privacy and data security. We did not then have a privacy office. We did not then have a chief privacy officer. Today we do, and a huge round of applause and great thanks to Mike Shapiro, who was our first chief privacy officer and who really has led the way for our county. He goes on to new challenges in a new location, but I want to say thank you again to him for extraordinary work in developing our privacy efforts here at the county. And a thank you as well to Yael Makagon, who's stepping up to lead the way during this transition. So thank you to you both. The next observation I have is that I'm particularly pleased that our office has chosen to tackle and assembled some experts to help us dive into the issue of smart communities. A tough one, frankly. I think all of us are certainly keenly aware of the opportunities that technology presents to create a better quality of life for the folks that we serve in government at every level, quite frankly, but certainly at the ground level, in the community, out in the neighborhoods. That being said, we're also mindful of the very legitimate, very real, very significant, in my view, privacy concerns that are part of that effort. I think we are going to hear today from some folks who are going to, I hope, help us think a little bit about how we thread the needle. I have always been of the view that public safety and forward-thinking technology are not inconsistent with public privacy. We can and should respect the potential for both. We know we have the technology to get the job done. The question is, do we have the political will and, frankly, the wisdom to use the technology in a way that's appropriate and beneficial without compromising the privacy concerns of our community? So with that, I'm going to say thank you again for joining us. I'm County Supervisor Joe Simitian. I have been the county's privacy advocate in chief, if there was such a title, since my return to the board some years ago. But really the thanks and the credit certainly go to our lean but very efficient and effective team in the privacy office. So with that, I will say thank you, hand it back over to the privacy office, and yeah, I'll ask you to help us get this thing kicked off so people can get right to the heart of the matter. Be well, everyone.
Thank you so much, Supervisor Simitian, for those remarks. And I would like to add my own welcome to our fourth annual Data Privacy Day. My name is Yael Makagon, and I'm senior staff in the Privacy Office of the County of Santa Clara. We have a wonderful event lined up for you today, and I would like to thank you all so much for joining us. I want to first reiterate my thanks to Supervisor Simitian for taking the time to open our event today. Supervisor Simitian has been a champion of privacy rights during his long tenure of serving the public, including spearheading the creation of the Privacy Office at the county, and we are grateful for his public service and support. Like Supervisor Simitian, I also want to thank our former Chief Privacy Officer, Mike Shapiro, who has recently stepped down from the position as he returns to the East Coast. For those who have attended our previous Data Privacy Day events, Mike was a familiar face, serving both as the visionary for their implementation as well as the host. He built and led the Privacy Office over the last 4 years, and while we will greatly miss him, we wish him the best on his next chapter. Turning now to our topic for today, our event is titled Smart Communities, Digital Connections and Privacy Protection. And I want to talk about each aspect of that title as part of this introduction. We'll be diving into the term smart communities in more depth during the event, but as commonly understood, They are cities, counties, and other entities that leverage network technology and software to provide services to their constituents. There is no question that there are many actual and potential benefits of these technologies. That is the digital connections part of our event title, because smart communities, at least as commonly conceived, generally promote connectivity through digital means as a fundamental aspect of their identity. At the same time, because smart communities generally rely on large volumes of data, including personal information to operate, there are also important privacy questions to consider. Anytime personal information is being collected, especially at scale, questions about purpose, access, use, and other data practices are relevant. That is the privacy protection part of our event title, and why it makes for such a compelling topic to discuss on Data Privacy Day. Let me take a moment to briefly go over our agenda for the event. We have 2 panels featuring a wonderful lineup of experts who together have years of experience that they can bring to bear on smart communities and the privacy questions that I alluded to earlier. Our first panel will help cover the fundamentals of the concept of smart communities and the potential privacy impacts involved. From there, we'll swing right into our second panel to discuss some real-world examples of smart communities and measures that they have taken to address privacy considerations. Following the second panel, we'll have a brief Q&A for all panelists. If members of the audience have any questions during the event, please use the Zoom Q&A feature where your questions will be provided to our support team and panelists. We'll do our best to address them during the event or respond afterward. We've also posted a couple of simple polling questions to get a better understanding of our audience, and we'll display those results shortly. Now, I would like to introduce the members of our first panel on smart communities, fundamentals, and privacy impacts. In the interest of time, I'll keep these introductions very brief, but for anyone who would like to learn more about the panelists, please feel free to refer to our event program. For this discussion, Aaron Deacon, the founder and managing director of Kansas City Digital Drive, will be our moderator. Aaron worked with mayors, entrepreneurs, and civic leaders in Kansas City and around the world to help build smart community ecosystems that connect infrastructure, emerging technology, and social impact. He combines high-level strategy with on-the-ground project implementation and management in a variety of areas, including smart communities efforts. Going in alphabetical order from there, Ben Green is a postdoctoral scholar in the Michigan Society of Fellows and an assistant professor in the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. He studies the social and political impacts of government algorithms with a focus on algorithmic fairness and the regulation of artificial intelligence. And he has literally written the book on smart cities, which is called The Smart Enough City, Putting Technology in Its Place to Reclaim Our Urban Future, which was published in 2019. Professor Brian Ray is a law professor at the Cleveland Marshall College of Law in Ohio. Professor Ray has extensive experience in information governance, cybersecurity, and data privacy. He co-founded and directs the Center for Cybersecurity and Privacy Protection, and his research focuses on security and privacy regulation, national and international jurisdiction over data, and data governance, among several other areas. Professor Lillian Edwards is a leading academic in the field of internet law at Newcastle Law School in the UK. She's the editor and major author of Law, Policy, and the Internet, one of the leading textbooks in the field of internet law, and she has won numerous awards for her work on privacy and technology policy issues. Of particular relevance to our discussion today, she's the author of a paper on privacy, security, and data protection in smart cities, which looks at this topic from a European perspective. Finally, Nicole Stevenson is managing director of Ground Up Consulting, a boutique firm she founded that provides privacy program management services to government, industry, and not-for-profit sectors. She's an advisory board member for the Center for Data Leadership and Initiative of the Smart Cities Council of Australia and New Zealand, and she won a leadership award in 2020 for her work in privacy strategy in Australian local governments. I think we're in for a very engaging discussion, and right now I'll go ahead and hand it over to Aaron to get us started.
Thank you. Thanks, Supervisor Simitian and all the folks at Santa Clara County. Also a shout out to Mike, who has been a great collaborator on this event over the years, and good to see those of you on the panel. Again, some of you, all of you I've seen, at least as we've prepared for this panel, but some of you I've run across and been on discussions with in the past, and others it's the first time. So excited to dig in. And as Yale mentioned, we're going to start as many smart cities conversations do about definitions, and we won't spend a lot of time there because I think that it's easy to get buried in that. But each of these conversations invites some new people to the table, and I think it's important to make sure we've got a handle on what it is that we're talking about. So I'm going to throw it out to you all. I'll pick on one of you if you want. But is there anyone who'd like to offer their kind of succinct smart cities definition, so we kind of level set on what it is that we're talking about with, or smart communities? Let's get rid of the cities distinction, but smart communities.
So Aaron, I always hate it when my students don't raise their hand, so I'll raise my hand. And I might be the least qualified because I haven't written a book or an extended article, as most of my co-panels have. In essence, when we talk about smart communities, we're really talking about communities or functions within communities that are starting to use sensors and distributed computing, usually over the internet, to gather information that can be useful in some way, either directly for that function or service, or in some other public interest, to accomplish something. That's not so succinct, but I think in essence we're talking about. So we're talking about sensors, we're talking about public functions, we're talking about information usually collected over the internet and stored in the cloud, a critical aspect that I know Lillian's addressed.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and I'm curious if anyone else. I heard sensors, distributed computing, cloud, data, and all in the service of public good. Nicole, something you'd like to add?
Yeah. Look, when I talk about definition of smart cities or smart communities, certainly within our sectors here in Australia, I think the most important thing is to make it digestible, right? So that the folks working in those spaces understand what it is they're doing, right, in terms of how we're defining their role. And so I often talk about smart cities as simply leveraging technology to make life faster, cleaner, safer, more equitable, or in some other way to benefit the community that we serve within our local governments.
I think that's a really interesting distinction, and I would be curious, Ben or Lillian, for you to kind of weigh in, because you sort of outlined a specific technology stack, Brian, or set of technology components, and Nicole, I think you cast the net a little bit wider, and I think that's really important when we start thinking about privacy and benefits and risk trade-offs, kind of how broadly we scope. Let's start with Lillian to sort of address that.
Sure. I'm actually looking at my own article for 2016.
That's good.
Which I haven't read for a very long time, which I didn't have a chance to print out either, to see what I said then. And it is interesting that what I've got there does start very much with this kind of usual technical definition, which I think has been, repeated all over the place, which is indeed that it involves networks of sensors attached to real world objects such as roads, cars, bridges, smart meters, domestic appliances, et cetera, that it involves real-time data streams that can also be combined and mined and repurposed, so you get profiling attached to it. It doesn't stand alone. It involves cloud-based infrastructure, as was already said. And yeah, that was most of what I had. So there's this buzz line that I've got from somewhere that they're said to interconnect people, data, things, and processes under a dynamic global infrastructure. But the definition, I'll come back to look at you guys, not a definition really, but the quote that I have often used a lot when talking about what I'm afraid I still think of as smart cities, is that they are 24/7 surveillance machines, right? So I'm not really coming at this, I have to say, forgive me, from the perspective of people involved in positive community projects, right? I very much came at this when I did, which is, seems incredibly now, 5, 6 years ago, to think about a threat model, really. There was a lot being written at the time about the threat model of security in smart cities. I knew computer scientists who were very worried about that. I'm not really entirely sure what happened to that, because at that point, the protocols for security on Internet of Things devices, including quite big ones like roads and dams and things, was apparently very, very poor indeed, and often, just like, having something called password as the password. But I was interested in privacy, not security, which to me are very, at least as a European lawyer, are two very, very different things. And
Agree. Yeah, and I think that's an interesting. So you've introduced another dynamic. When I heard on the tech stack question, I heard you sort of go where Brian went, right? Specific tech stack around sensors, data collection, and compute. So one vector is what actual pieces of technology are we talking about, with that at one end, and sort of a broader, more expansive technology in general. The other vector that you've sort of introduced is the public good projects. Which is the optimistic view that Brian kind of laid out, and the 24/7 surveillance machine, which some might argue favorably for, but I think you present in a more negative light. Ben, I'm curious on those kind of where you see the definition between those two different vectors, and then on each of them, maybe there's something else you want to add.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, and everyone. Really nice to be part of this discussion with you all today. I mean, I think, what I would add, I think it's very natural to want us to start with the sort of nuts and bolts of here are the technologies that we're talking about and so on, and to treat smart communities in that sense. But I think in addition, to build off what Lillian was saying, it's also useful to think about smart as somewhat of a political or ideological movement around cities or communities. And then, we might different people could reasonably disagree about what that entails. On some accounts, that means, we're making city governments smarter in the sense of, better logistics, more efficient, and so on. My read is often that the word smart as a movement entails a impulse to apply technology to a lot of really intractable urban problems, often driven in part, or often in large part, by the technology industry, and that varies depending on the jurisdiction or country in which you're in. But so I think sort of viewing it not just as here's a set of technologies, but also smart and smart communities as these somewhat ideological terms that then sort of shape our vision of how are we even thinking about the use of technology to be applied to urban problems. How are we perceiving what those problems are? How are we thinking about solving them? And then how does that lead, or how does that view of smartness shape the opportunities and also shape the risks that come alongside that?
I think that's great. And if I hear that correctly, you are really leaning into Nicole's broader technology sort of side of that spectrum, and really highlighting as kind of the more priority that second vector around impact, right? Like what are we trying to achieve? Less about the stack, more about, okay, are we doing public good, or are we doing harm through creating a surveillance state? And I think that certainly makes sense to me. I do think, especially in the context of a privacy conversation, that the proposed opportunities to do good, or to add efficiencies, or to increase outcomes, and also the technologies that that lead to the adverse outcomes, like surveillance state, do involve a lot of data collection, a lot of personal data collection, a lot of sensors in new places where they weren't before, is collecting individualized data. And that is part of the sort of innovation that puts us in a place to have this conversation. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah.
And so when we think about where we are now in terms of sensors and data collection, I think it's maybe worth spending just a few minutes, and some of this may feel obvious, but sort of talking about those trade-offs at a high level. You know, why are we in a place where we're doing these things? And I'm gonna ask maybe you and Ben and Lillian first, who in your opening remarks have taken a bit of an adverse position, you know, to defend why people want them. Why are people interested in adopting these technologies? And what do they think is the good that comes out of it that we couldn't do before?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think that there's, you know, the general motivating goal among a lot of the public, a lot of city actors, public leaders, and so on, is the idea that technology can provide either information that can improve services. You know, if we can have a better understanding of what's going on around the city or the community, we can better, you know, deploy services, we can be more efficient in terms of allocating resources and so on. Also potential opportunities for connectivity, for understanding traffic flows and so on. So there's, I would say, really connected to the idea you mentioned earlier about data collection, where there's a sense of, you know, if we can put various types of sensors, whether that's cameras or traffic monitors or so on, onto different types of infrastructure. So this is often this idea of Internet of Things, where you have sensors on trash cans and streetlights and so on. We could get more information about what's happening in the city, and then we could leverage that information to make better decisions about what we should do, what governance should look like, and so on. And so, you know, I think a lot of the question then becomes, you know, what leads to those beliefs, and how often are those opportunities actually able to be realized? So I'll sort of just tee those up as a, you know, sort of the next steps from this vision of what the benefit is. Then the question is, how accurate is that vision? Where does that come from? And what do we go from there?
And let's go with you, with that question kind of to you, Lillian. Do you think those things are reasonable to hope to achieve through these new technologies?
Well, it depends whose perspective you're coming from. I mean, the thing I was sitting here thinking,
from your perspective.
No, that's not the point. The point is there are at least four sets of actors probably involved in creating smart city infrastructure, you know, and sorry, I am an old-fashioned person who uses the term smart cities. Which I think in itself is really discursively interesting, because again, sitting here thinking about it, it's not a term I hear bandied around in these positive contexts you're talking about within the UK. And I think to a large extent in the EU. To me, that term, you know, and this has happened in Canada as well with Google Sidewalks and so forth. To me, that term has become besmirched, I have to say, with the kind of aspects we talked about before. And for example, when you're talking about urban data, when you're talking about urban data observatories, where, you know, when you're talking about, you know, profiling centers where you can put this data together to produce good stuff, there is much talk of open data, of data trusts, of data cooperatives, you know, of local data management. I don't hear any of these people using the term smart cities. So I just throw that in as a kind of interesting narrative point. But to come back to my dinosaur-like, you know, interest in smart cities, whose city is it? Whose data is it, right? So when you talk about who is it good for, you know, I mean, you have at least two obvious actors to a cynical person like me, which is, you know, the state, the administrative bodies, the welfare bodies, the police, the law enforcement agencies will take an opportunity to collect data which might be used to create harms of, say, profiling, discrimination, unfairness. You know, and we see that most notably in the big fight that is going on, she says in a very technical phrase, around about face recognition by law enforcement agencies, particularly real-time, you know, profiling, biometric face recognition that also gives you added value and gives you things like emotion recognition and biometric categorization, say, of ethnic groups, all these kind of value added to face recognition things that have come along in the last few years in a big way. So, at that point, are we looking at a positive outcome? Well, yeah, we might be, because we might be cleaning up the streets, to use a phrase. But many people think that all we're doing, and I am not the expert here, I'm not a criminologist, is moving that bad stuff around. That we're perhaps withdrawing police from areas that we don't want to spend money on surveilling, or we're, getting higher cleanup rates by putting police into bad areas, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole thing has to be seen, I think, as heavily politicized. And I say that as someone who is primarily a lawyer, not a criminologist or a political scholar, but this seems obvious, right? And the other
and is
group,
that, you see, are you going to get into your second group? Because
well,
you
I was
said
just going to mention my second, and then I'll shut up.
Excellent.
Okay.
Okay.
So the point also is that I think at the beginning of the story that I encountered in 2016, there was a kind of naive belief that it would indeed be the government, the law enforcement agencies, the admin people who would gather that data and who would provide benefits for the public, depending on your view. But actually the reality was that the data was being gathered by the private sector. Now, maybe that's less surprising for a US audience, which is what we primarily have here probably. But for me, as someone in the UK, embedded at that point in Europe and Europe, privacy laws, this was kind of a remarkable discovery, that the names you came across were Cisco and Siemens for the hardware, the telcos, and then as time went on, it was very much the giant cloud suppliers, so it was Amazon, Google, Microsoft, the usual suspects, right? Some of the telcos, then you get into Apple, all the rest of it, the people who supply apps, all the way up and down the stack. And these are the people who were seeing enormous gains in having this whole amazing new source of real-time and, continuing data. Because we all know probably on this panel that there is far more data being generated by the Internet of Things now than there was from classic kind of Web 2.0 interactions online, right? Because there are so many widgets in the world that you could gather data with. So if you look at it from that perspective, who gains? Whose data is it, right? And I think the positive thing to finish maybe is this move that we're seeing, that I'm seeing in the UK, towards thinking about ways of almost of taking back control over that data. This idea of using data trust, data cooperatives, data management, although I'm quite cynical about that as well. But I think that is an interesting development that's really come on board since I wrote that article.
That's great, and I want to come back to that, but first I want to see Brian as one of two Americans on the panel. To get a reaction to that idea that the private sector being a key beneficiary was sort of surprise, perhaps in the UK. Did that surprise you? And do you agree that the state and the private sector are the two categories of who is it good for?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, I recall a conversation this is now at least 3 or 4 years ago, I had with someone who was part of a Boston smart streetlight project, and we were talking about contracting, and the contract from the vendor stated that the data that was being collected was a trade secret of the vendor and therefore wasn't subject to, so I think we've moved past sort of those kind of really egregious grabs at data. Maybe we haven't, but there's no question that the business model of smart city technologies, and here I am thinking mainly about sort of the IoT sensor collection technologies, was initially and probably still is to a large extent the same model as apps, where the part of the payoff at least is the ability to collect in theoretically aggregated and pseudonymized form data to be able to do analytics for other things. And I think that very much still is in play, and it's one of the big issues. Just to circle back, I think what Lillian's identified and what Ben set up is, there are sort of two sets of issues that we worry about. The first one is, do these things do what they promise to do? And I absolutely agree with Ben that one of the big issues that we have is there's lots of big promises and lots of disappointments. ShotSpotter is a really good example. It's a gunshot sensor technology. They've actually done a lot of things to try to protect privacy, at least in theory. But it turns out recent analyses are showing that it doesn't work. There's lots of false positives, lots of indications that say, hey, there's been a likely gunshot. And what does that lead to? Well, it leads to this other problem that Lillian identified, which is over surveillance and over deployment of, in this case, policing resources in generally poor and communities of color, so that in theory it was going to make police more efficient. If it's not working, it's not making police more efficient, and it's exacerbating what's already an over surveillance problem by deploying police officers in a heightened state of expectation that something serious has happened, right, in communities. And so that's a big issue. And of course, it's particularly sharp when it comes to policing. Now, in that context, ShotSpotter isn't, in fact, gathering and collecting any kind of data. It really is a service. But if it's not working, why bother?
Yeah, so this is great. You were starting to move us in a bit of more a practical direction, right? In terms of how do you evaluate these trade-offs and kind of what are the things that we're looking at. Nicole, I'd like to kind of go back to these two categories, right? So if the state and the private sector are the imagined beneficiaries, the one thing that I think that you would hear from a smart city optimist or apologist is the real beneficiary ought to be the community, right? And Lillian and Brian both referenced the kinds of community benefits that you might see, but they've referenced it with skepticism or with counter evidence that the evidence often presented by the state and the corporate sector, both, I think, isn't accurate. How do you see that? I mean, do you see a community benefit angle to this? Is there a user that is not the state or the private sector that these technologies could be good for?
Right. So I actually think we kind of need to, earlier on when I was defining what I thought a smart city is, and I cast the net a little bit wider, and I talked about just leveraging technology generally, that's sort of my way of acknowledging that we're in a really, really neat place globally at the moment. And I think we're remiss if we don't acknowledge the fourth industrial revolution and that space that we're in terms of the data economy and the preoccupation that we have globally, in a political context, an economic context, and a social context with data. And, data is derived of various different types of technology, right? Whether it's that sort of the sensing technologies, your IoT, could be things like social media, for example, or the technologies that are used to gather the information that allows those the big data giants to market to us, for example, right? So we've got, I think, our understanding of what technology is in the context is really important, but also what's happening globally that's, I guess, generating this preoccupation with using it in the first place. And I say this because when we talk about how governments are to benefit, so our local governments are to benefit from the use of these technologies, we kind of have to go back to first principles about why a government would use technology that gathers the data of its citizens. Ostensibly, it's supposed to be for the benefit of the community, right? So when I put my privacy Pollyanna hat on and I look at it from that perspective, it's a pretty good sales technique for someone in privacy to get a local government on board with why we need to put controls in place, right? It's for the protection of the community to make sure that this data that we're gathering about them that's ostensibly for their own good is actually put to an appropriate use. The reality is, I don't think that those discussions go that far at the moment. And that's where my concern is. So, even though I have this privacy Pollyanna point of view when I take the discussion to local governments, I'm using that point of view in order to leverage a particular outcome, because I realize that within this context of the fourth industrial revolution that we're that we're all in at the moment. It's all about the data. It's about getting more data, leveraging the data, adding the data to the data, understanding the data, selling things and buying things, and really, because of the data that we have, there's this preoccupation with that. And it really dehumanizes the whole discussion of what a smart city is intended to do, which is to serve the community. And so I find that there's this weird and really uncomfortable kind of tautology, right? We just keep going around in circles again and again and again in this discussion, and we kind of are going nowhere. And I really picked up on Lillian's points about harms associated with using technologies in this kind of under the guise of community benefit. There is a lot of that sort of self-talk, I think, that happens particularly in our government contexts. Yes, we say it's for the community benefit, but the reality is, no, it's serving us. It's allowing us to do what we need to do as governments, and also our private sector partners that are helping us to bring these technologies into the local government space. Well, they're receiving a benefit too. I've yet to see a whole lot of demonstrable benefit for the community, except in the context of, again, that wider global information or data economy context where people want access or appear to want access to things in a faster and more equitable way. Hence why we love to offer people access to our free Wi-Fi networks through their social media accounts. Individuals think, oh, that's awesome, I can get access to what I need and I don't even have to hop off Facebook. But the reality is that's benefiting Facebook or Meta now, and the government, because each of them are gathering that level of data. The individual in the community maybe doesn't have a sense of that at all.
So I think you're making, you posited something that I think is important, which is sort of this recognition of the moment we're in, right? The fourth industrial revolution, we're here, we've got sensors, we've got data, a lot of people have them, they're out there, it's in the world. And so in a local government context, you're making decisions in that reality. And you're, maybe hoping for some good, and you've got to figure out a way to evaluate the trade-offs and to understand what the adverse effects are. So let's maybe talk specifically, and I'd put this to each of you, kind of what some of those are, what the adverse, and if you've got a specific example, you may or may not want to call out a specific government, but you're certainly welcome to, of a thing that's been done and put into place, and look at this bad consequence that's happened.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. And I think, what I would add sort of in relation to the prior discussion with Aaron, between you and Nicole, is that, I think certainly from a normative perspective, the goal should be to benefit communities. And then the question is the current model of how we think about smartness and pursue smartness actually in line to create those benefits for communities? So I think there's sort of the gap that I see between, the broad normative goal that we should be striving for as whether it's policymakers, citizens, governments, and so on, and the method by which we're actually trying to pursue those goals. So yeah, I think, two examples that I think highlight some of these risks I'll talk about briefly. So one is down in San Diego, where there was an effort to pursue smart streetlights with a contract with General Electric, and there was all sorts of promises about improved traffic efficiency and so on. And what was discovered after a couple of years was that the data from those sensors was not useful. It was not being used to reduce traffic. The contract was over budget, but the information from those sensors and cameras was being used for law enforcement investigations, was being used to spy on protests, particularly Black Lives Matter protests. So we have this, we have the promises of what this technology can achieve in terms of saving money, reducing traffic. Those promises weren't able to be realized. And then at the same time, we have then the downstream, implications of what happens once these sensors are in place in terms of what sorts of, we might be okay perhaps with a transit authority having some sorts of data, but that's very different than what it means for the local police department to have that access to those cameras or sensors and so on. So there's that case study, and then one other I would just sort of quickly highlight was in Columbus, Ohio, which won the Smart Cities Challenge in 2016 from the Department of Transportation. And I actually was a really big fan of their proposal. I think that their proposal that won the award or the grant from DOT was actually a really great model of what it looks like to integrate technology into social planning in a way that is thoughtful and puts communities at the forefront rather than technology. And what the retrospectives have found now that the 5-year window of that grant is up is that it was really hard for them to stick with the efforts that were more oriented at helping impoverished communities. And a lot of the energy and time went into the more flashy tech things. The technology companies were just swarming all over the community and swarming all over the policymakers. And so even though they had what's one of the best plans I've seen about how to use technology, it was then so hard to act on that because there's, again, just so much gravity pushing towards the more tech-centric efforts and pushing towards the technology vendors all trying to have their say and have their piece.
Yeah, those are great examples. Any others that the panel would like to share?
I could just throw in, just to show the trans-global existence of anecdata that I have a near identical story, not really backed up by hard evidence from my involvement with the Glasgow Smart Cities competition, which is why I started looking into it, because I was teaching in Glasgow, which is, this big crime-ridden city, kind of Gothamish in Scotland. And they won what seemed like a lot of money at the time to become a smart city. And, I am, again, not the urban planner, right? But it seemed evident to me that if you have a stripped out public sector, you have austerity measures, you have a failure to skill up, say, your police forces with good technology and understanding of how it can benefit communities, then they will invariably turn to the tech vendors, right? To get quick results, right? To give payback, as it were, to the politicians who gave them the money, even in a country like the UK, where largely the politicians, are quite separate from the police, it's not like elected police or anything. And therefore what you get is quick wins, right? You get quick wins. You get like, let's turn some of our lampposts into smart listening, smart CCTV lampposts outside of Central Station, which is our big railway station. And as far as I could tell, there was, this is anecdotal, there was very little positive benefit from that period of getting funding to be a smart city that probably wouldn't have happened anyway, right? And the people who probably benefited were probably the tech vendors who got some nice contracts out of it. So, one of the features I had in my 2016 article I just noticed with smart cities is that they invariably involve public-private partnerships, PPPs, which were just coming into vogue as really part of, neoliberal capitalism at about the time that I was writing in the UK, because we are past the world where we think that the state, the public sector, can provide the good stuff for its people. We're in the world where the public sector is hollowed out. I'm not usually this Marxist. And, these services can only be delivered, it is believed, by the private sector, right? And so this is a great opportunity for the private sector to A, get contracts, and B, get data, and C, get in with politicians. So it's not surprising that it tends to end up not really delivering huge urban quality of life benefits, but delivers really quite big benefits for the tech vendors. And the kind of other example, there's two things to say, right? Is that I think the reason why I haven't actually gone on writing very much about smart cities in the following 5 years is because it just became part of the bigger problem of private-public data collection in health, in policing, in urban data, and algorithmic profiling and management, and impacts. It just became part of that bigger problem. So it ceased to be, I think, a problem on its own of what does the Internet of Things, say to these social problems, and what are the harms that result. And it became part of general profiling. You know, so one of my, again, crazy anecdote examples, which I was just searching for and failing to find, so forgive me if it's not true, okay, but I think it illustrates the point, is that I think it was reported in The Guardian that we have introduced apps in the UK, just as I'm sure very many US and North American states have, that try to predict which families will be risky to children, you know, so that you can put in early intervention into those families to try and check that the children are okay, right? So you can put them under supervision and management, and that worst case, remove them from those families, right? So you have triage, you know, by app, which families look dodgy. And there was this story that somehow data about which children have not returned their library books had been rolled into these apps, yeah? And so that this had become a risk signal. So you have this well-known taxonomy of risk assessment, of which smart cities and the Internet of Things have just become another signal, yeah? And we all know the harms and the problems and the errors that that carries.
So we've got a good bucket of kind of adverse examples, and Brian and Nicole, you can add some as you get into your next remarks. But I'd like to kind of there's a lot encompassed in those, even in the few examples that we've had, right? There's a lot of different things that can go bad, and so I want to kind of focus us back on the privacy question. And Nicole, maybe you made a great point, Lillian, about differentiating cybersecurity and privacy. So that's kind of two buckets, certainly intertwined in some ways, but thinking about privacy as something that we value, and that society values. Different societies maybe to different levels and in different ways, and for different parts of society. But you've done a lot of work with children, Nicole. Can you give us your thoughts kind of on the adverse effects specific to the privacy bucket?
Right. That's actually a really huge question, right? And so the first thing I'd love to do is just capitalize on this privacy and security not being the same thing. Because I can tell you 99 times out of 100 when I'm asked to consult to a local government or anyone actually about a technology deployment, I'm the little voice at the back of the room. I'm a big voice, but usually I'm at the back of the room until very quietly I say, what about privacy? And then someone says, oh, no, that's okay. We've got security covered. And then I have to go back and explain how privacy and security are different things in practice, that, security is the fence that we build around that which we wish to protect, right? The data or the assets or the whatever. That privacy is that narrower lane of protecting the personal information of you and of me and of the community that we serve through its life cycle within the context of a particular technology deployment, right? And it's a degree of principle-based decision-making that's supposed to, privacy provides our guardrails for making good choices around what happens to personal information through its life cycle. That's where it gets challenging though, right? Because depending on who you ask, they set their privacy benchmark high or low. Often, certainly in a city's context, it does come back to that preoccupation with data and with technology and having access to the bright, shiny thing. And the privacy failure, I think, actually starts at an elemental governance level. So, for example, here in Australia, and apologies if you can hear behind me, the kookaburras have started laughing. So it's what time is it? 4:49 in the morning. So they'll be carrying on laughing. And if it makes you smile, I won't think you're laughing at me, I promise. In Australia, there is something called the City Deal. And the City Deal is where the Federal Department of Innovation provides buckets of money to cities that would like to get on board the technology bandwagon, right? And what city's not going to want to do that, right? Many of our city decision makers are a bit like magpies in this way, and they see the brightest, shiniest, newest tech, and they want it, and they want to be the first to get it and deploy it. And so the City Deal gets rolled out where local governments are invited to, submit proposals for why they should have access to, say, the 5 technologies that are on offer. And they put together their proposals and they talk about all the things that we talked about earlier, right? We want to leverage this technology to make life better for our communities and to make evidence-based decisions, et cetera, et cetera. So the cities are submitting all of these applications, but at no point in the decision-making process where the federal government is deciding who's going to get the bucket of money and the technology and who's not, at no point has there been a requirement for these local governments to have their privacy houses in order, for them to be able to demonstrate that they know what needs to be done in terms of protecting personal information through its life cycle outside of that basic information security or cybersecurity component. And even that is chronically underdone. So what we have is money being funneled to cities to buy and deploy technologies without those essential guardrails in place. Many local governments in Australia don't even have a privacy officer. And if they do, that officer is relegated to the role of say, fulfilling access to information requests, right? Give me access to the personal information you hold about me, or let me correct it if I think it's wrong. Those officers do that work, but privacy is so much bigger than that. So that's just me editorializing on, where I think a really big governance problem exists. In terms of the potential harms, though, to the community, interestingly, the one that I see a lot is that sense of being observed. So often these technologies are about observing the community, right? Gathering information about them so that we can make decisions about them or for them, about access to services or benefits, or some aspect of criminality if the data gathering is happening by CCTV. So when people feel like they are being observed and it makes them uncomfortable, there's a key privacy harm that comes from that, which is decisional interference. They decide they're going to do something else so that they can remove themselves from observation. And we see this really critically in the context of CCTV. And I can't recall which of my colleagues pointed it out. I think it may have actually been Lillian again, which was some of these technologies are actually just, potentially moving a problem somewhere else. The data that we're gathering from those technologies is not actually serving the community at all. This is the case in CCTV, and I know that this has been proved just in terms of general CCTV and whether or not it prevents criminal behavior. It doesn't. It just moves it somewhere where the CCTV cameras are not. So what we see in the context of decisional interference in the community, if I'm going about my private life and I don't want to be observed in that for whatever reason, maybe I'm going for my jog and I don't look particularly good in spandex and I just don't really want that being on someone's feed. I will choose to run somewhere or go for my jog somewhere that the cameras are not. So that's interfering in the choices that I would ordinarily make in life. And I think that that's a really big one, a big privacy harm that we don't often look at in the context of smart cities.
So as we ran, we've got about 7 minutes left, and could go on with this conversation for hours and hours. And I think in the next panel, they'll get a little bit more hands-on in terms of the kind of what do you do. And so to maybe kind of tee that up, sort of following on what Nicole said, Brian, would like your thoughts on sort of what it even means for a government to value privacy, right? I mean, the nature of privacy has changed, to the point of where we are. Citizens give up information voluntarily all the time. They do it for convenience. They do it for apps. They do it to the private sector. They do it to the public sector. I mean, the social media culture has changed the nature of how we share about ourselves and what the expectations of data and who owns it are. Nicole mentioned that there are some cities in Australia that don't have chief privacy officers. There are a handful here that do, but most don't have places there. So who actually owns this data, and what is the government's obligation in thinking about the citizens' rights to their data?
Yeah. So I mean, as my Boston example illustrates, it's a fraught question with lots and lots of uncertainty and certainly in the US, no overarching kind of protections or presumptive sort of positioning on who owns what when. It really is subject to private contracting arrangements. So it puts the onus on the public entity who is entering into the relationship, typically with fewer resources and less capacity to evaluate this, to try to establish those ground rules at the front, and then anticipate to what extent, you know, data that's, what kinds of data might be collected and how it might move, flow, and go. And so it's very, very complicated. And I mean, unfortunately, there aren't, in the US at least, there aren't rules, and public collection of data is exempt from the limited rules we have at some states like California. For the most part, I mean, we have the FIPS, and we have certain things, especially when it comes to the federal government. But for the most part, it's pretty wide open, and those are really hard questions. And as Nicole points out, you know, often the incentives are to just rely on the vendor. Although we've got great examples like Santa Clara County and others where you do have chief privacy officers and privacy offices that are trying to grapple with the complexity to this, and at least put in place some processes and some standard policies that will, or at least have a set resource that entities who are looking to acquire things can come to and get some advice about it. But it's hard, and as Lillian pointed out, it's part of this really much bigger issue in society around, you know, we're not just consenting to do things, things are getting, you know, information is getting collected about us all the time in ways that
we're in process, right? I mean, it's really dynamic. Yeah. It keeps changing. It's hard to say for sure where it's headed. I mean, Lillian, you posted, or Brian, I think you posted a link to Lillian's article that she referenced. I think that was
someone had asked for
6 years ago. What's changed? I mean, how do we see the change? And I'm going to ask you this next, Ben, and it may end up being our last comment, depending on how long we go. You know, I mean, your book came out a few years ago too, right? So you kind of come at this from one perspective, but if you look over now, the past few years, start with Lillian, how have things, if at all, changed in terms of what Brian was just describing?
Okay, so that's me first, is it? Sorry, I don't want to talk over Ben. For Ben, who I think hasn't had enough airtime. It's a really good book. So there's two things I really want to say in the time available. I was beginning to get quite interested there. One is, even, this is where I stop being cynical, right? We do have good laws about this in the EU. We actually do, right? One thing I would say is that you're starting from the wrong place to talk about who owns the data. You should talk about who's got a right to control the data. That is about them. Right? I mean, in the EU, that's a human rights issue, but you could also see it as a consumer rights issue, if you like, okay, if you really want to. And we have laws that basically say that if you are extracting data from your devices, which is often your smartphone, but could be your car or your, your smart fridge or your smart meter, your smart, power energy meter, all these kind of things, your smart home, your Alexa speaker, right? If you're extracting or accessing data from these, then we've got something called e-privacy law that more or less says, without going into all the details, that you have to give consent, that you have to give some kind of prior explicit consent. Now, this is the same law that's about cookies, right? So we all know just how formalistic and pointless and banal that consent can be. But it's particularly pointless in the context of the Internet of Things for a bunch of reasons that I'll just reel off, okay? Number one, you're often in public with very little transparency that your data is being collected at all. Right? You go past the smart lamppost, the smart CCTV, you go past the Wi-Fi hotspot. You don't even know a lot of the time, depending if you're really smart and how you've configured your phone, that your phone is connecting. So there is this pervasive, seamless, ambient collection of data, all these words that get thrown around, which used to be seen as positive, and I think is now substantially a negative. There's a lack of notice. And therefore, how do you?
Lillian, I'm getting the 1 minute warning from Samira. Okay. So I'm going to hand off and let Ben get the last word here.
Okay. Can I just say one last thing, which is that people will pretend the data that is collected is anonymized, and it isn't, right? Because it's almost impossible to anonymize data. Okay, Ben.
Great. That's a super important point. So I'm glad you got that in, Lillian. I think just very quickly, the main thing that I've seen as a change from when I wrote the book has been the changing public and political dynamics and assumptions about smart cities and communities, where a few years ago, I think over the last few years, there's the main things that have given me optimism about what the future of this can look like are the local organizing efforts in communities across the US and elsewhere in the world, pushing back on facial recognition software, on unjust algorithms, on public-private partnerships that give far too much control over to companies, and so on. And so I think a lot of where I've seen change in terms of what the landscape of assumptions and what's possible and what the standard protocol of action is has been shaped by these sorts of bottom-up organizing efforts. And so, hopefully maybe that's that sort of sense of where do we go for the future and how do we get there is maybe something to tee up into the next panel.
That's awesome. Well, I appreciate ending on an optimistic note. Thank you all so much. Thanks, Yale and Samira, for hosting us, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you so much, Aaron, and to all the panelists for that fantastic conversation, laying the groundwork for this complex topic. I'll save any attempts to kind of summarize what we have discussed for some very brief remarks at the end. And I also want to note that some questions have been posed in the chat. We're tracking those, and we have a few minutes at the end of the event to ask those of the panelists. So we ask for your indulgence and patience, so we can swing right into our next panel to discuss smart communities in practice, preserving privacy now and in the future. So again, I'll provide some very brief introductions for our second panel and then hand it off to our moderator. For this discussion, Rob Lloyd, the Chief Information Officer and Deputy City Manager for the City of San Jose, will serve as our moderator. Over 2 decades, he has held C-level roles in the technology, government, and utilities sectors in several Western states, including California, and he brings that expertise to bear in the smart community efforts that the City of San Jose is pursuing. Going in alphabetical order from there, Jackie Liu is the president and co-founder of Helpful Places, a startup focused on creating universal standards for smart communities, particularly in regard to the language and terminology used to describe them. She was the director of digital integration at Sidewalk Labs, a company focused on developing smart cities, and she served as the inaugural director of data analytics at New York City's Department of Parks and Recreation. Jigyasa Sharma is a smart communities program manager at US Ignite, a nonprofit organization focused specifically on accelerating smart communities. She works with US Ignite partners on a variety of smart community related topics, including privacy, data governance, equity issues, and community engagement. And she also manages Project Overcome, an initiative funded by the National Science Foundation promoting the deployment of broadband technology solutions to both rural and urban underserved communities. Katrina Destre is Director of Privacy at Kuma LLC, a global privacy and security consulting company to public and private sector organizations. She advises organizations on operationalizing privacy, including through the application of privacy by design principles. She's a member of a NIST advisory committee that encourages smart city and Internet of Things stakeholders to develop and deploy standard-based solutions. And finally, Kelsey Finch is Senior Counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum, or FPF, focusing on smart cities and communities, among other select projects. She leads FPF's Smart Privacy for Smart Cities project under a grant from the National Science Foundation, and she also runs FPF's Smart Cities and Communities Working Group and serves as an expert and thought leader helping stakeholders leverage the benefits of a data-rich society while minimizing threats to individual privacy and civil liberties. And with that, I'll now hand it over to Rob to take things forward from here.
Thank you very much, Yale. And good morning to everyone. We're glad to have such an auspicious group for you to talk about how we preserve privacy now and into the future. We also have a diverse audience from many roles with us, so carrying the torch from panel 1, which was great. We're in store for an enlightening discussion, and I think it's going to go pretty quickly. By way of background, privacy has emerged as a crucial topic because of the use of data, sensing technologies, and digital footprints we leave creates new risks along with some opportunities for personalization and efficiencies. But like words said aloud, there's no taking back data once exposed. And new laws are proposed legislation are aiming to put new controls in place for responsible use, of that data in tandem with our information security functions. However, we are missing needed maturity. I think we would all agree. A recent survey from the Center for Digital Government paints a clear picture that connects with the previous panel. Exceptionally few state and local governments have privacy efforts at all. Those efforts are largely other duties as assigned just to meet compliance needs. And we can count on two hands the number of governments that actually have privacy principles, a formal program, any public engagement on privacy with an ethic of protecting that public trust. Fortunately, Santa Clara County and the city of San Jose have emerged as national leaders in the intersection of security and privacy, which is keeping that public trust. And we have partnered with the Center for Digital Government to provide tools, usable templates, and playbooks to increase the baseline of privacy in state and local governments in ways that put empathy and responsibility for our communities at center. And so I get to welcome you to that community. And now we're going to dive in. So first up, much of the work that communities do involves trust and using data to make key decisions, as well as run effective programs. And we can think of lots of examples beyond just policing and Next Gen 911, redistricting, how we do transportation management, digital inclusion and impact, or blight programs. But these require balancing civic good and the risks inherent in using sensing technologies and data. Tapping the deep experience of our panel, maybe Jigyasa, if you can start for us, what are a few of the defining themes that shape preserving privacy? And where is your work focusing to respond to those challenges?
Thanks, Job. Thanks for that wonderful question. I do want to say I feel honored to be on this panel. And I love the combination of J's and K's we have here. So I'm pretty excited for the next 1 hour. So to get us started, I think a little bit about US Ignite. We are a tech nonprofit at DC, and we work with nearly a network of 50 communities. And I'm going to answer your second question first. We provide technical and project management support to our communities, and my role is to help our communities use the people and the policy lens to evaluate their smart city projects. Interestingly, I wrote a guide which is pretty much based on the balancing act that you're talking about, where we talked about that municipal leaders can foster civic trust by focusing on 5 policy domains, and privacy was, of course, one of them. I'm going to just shoot a link to that in the chat. So getting back to your first question, which is around themes, to give a very quick example, one of our communities, County of Arlington, launched the Safety and Innovation Project early last year, where they were setting up sensors to collect data on pedestrian count to enhance public safety and pedestrian safety. We worked with them to set up an oversight panel to take care of the privacy concerns. So some of the things that came up were issues around accountability, right? Like, how do we make sure that the data is being used for what it is said it is being used? How do we make sure that the additional features that the technology has is not turned on by any malicious actor or even by the county itself as well? Second thing that came up quite a bit was consent, and also to a great extent transparency. How do you let people know what data is being collected, how it's being collected, and how it is being used? And third, I would like to point out something that's close to my heart is the question of equity. How do we make sure that the data that is collected is not being used to discriminate against a certain group? So those were some of the themes that have emerged. There are more, but I'm going to leave that for my co-panelists that have emerged in my work so far.
That's awesome. And Kelsey, for the Future of Privacy Forum, this connects to some of the work that your group has done. Can you kind of expand on some of those thoughts in the question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think in celebration of Data Privacy Day, Data Protection Day, the thing that actually strikes me is that those sort of defining themes and principles are just the fair information practices, or the practice principles, whichever is your flavor of FIPS. But we see the conversation come again and again to these same big principles of openness, and sort of choice of participation, accountability, security. And I think that it's encouraging to me that we have that as a common touch point with other things that are going on in the privacy conversation in the community. But what I really like also in the smart cities context and sort of smart communities context is that we're able to talk about values and context in a really in a broader way than we might in the commercial space. So really focusing on how do we articulate the purpose and the benefits to communities of using these technologies. And if we can't articulate those benefits, maybe we should rethink how we're using them. How do we give people meaningful choices given the range of challenges that we see about this uniquely collective experience, this public environment, this interesting intersection of existing laws, maybe outdated laws, and emerging technologies. I think also that equity piece really sounds strongly through in my experience as well as something that is much more driving the conversation in the public sector and in local government than I would see in commercial spaces. And I think that's really encouraging that we have some common ground, some common language, but we're also able to think about the ways in which privacy is expanding. And I'll just say that sort of from our perspective and from the work that I've been doing with FPF, it's really been trying to focus on supporting those folks on the ground who are making this work day to day. This is really challenging work. And so we're trying to do whatever we can to support, provide resources, to help build that privacy infrastructure in local government, which hasn't really existed until the last couple of years, and which is growing quickly, but still has quite some ways to go. So that involves running some peer networks, that involves helping connect people with good partners, and then also making sure that our local governments can ask the right questions and reach for the right tools, and really take all of these big pictures and start to operationalize them in practice, which is where I think sort of that rubber meets the road is always the hardest step. So eager to get to help out in these spaces.
And government so often is defined by the doers. And Jackie, let me have you weigh in because you have an interesting perspective. Parks and Rec, you saw some of what worked and didn't work with Sidewalk Labs, helpful places, and you kind of build on what Kelsey was talking about, that empathy in practice. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, it is really about where the rubber hits the road between, I think, where these principles are around privacy and sort of operations. I mean, I guess one of my perspective on this is that I actually think what we often refer to as privacy is actually shorthand for like really this deeper issue that I think both, like Kelsey mentioned, it's the deeper issue of like whether or not it's actually possible to trust this novel technology or the use of this data. And it's because these technologies are largely invisible and the decisions and the actions that they power are sort of largely unseen. I think my sort of leanings now is that this is actually really more of a bigger issue around how do you effectively communicate the benefits and the risks that are associated with data collection, and that for most people often get just sort of like summarized up into, but I am worried about privacy. And I kind of come at this from like, based on some of the research that I've worked on, this is less often about the specifics of the personal data that is actually being processed and more about how it is difficult for a regular person to be able to just judge for themselves the relative benefit of that technology, whether it's sort of outcomes for a group or for themselves as a person, compared to what they are being asked to provide, in this case, sort of data collection. Like we don't make that sort of rubric like available for them to engage with and interact with. And so I think when we think about like when people are asking for transparency and looking for accountability, my question is like, well, are we giving them enough information so that they can even have agency in being able to evaluate that trade-off, which is actually one of, I think, the root things that people are looking for when they're trying to think about trust. And so my work currently is like informed by working in the public sector, where I was largely, working to operationalize the use of technology and data in the public sector, which was less about privacy concerns, but was definitely about trust. It's like, well, is this technology even really going to like do anything? Is it going to drive the sort of outcomes that we're hoping for, to sort of the present day and like the learnings through Sidewalk Labs to now, my work now at Helpful Places really sort of focuses on looking at how we can, through design, start to imagine how there can be these better interfaces between for digital systems and places for people, so that people can start to be empowered to come to some of these conclusions and like evaluate some of these technologies for themselves. And so I think that's just kind of where the perspective that I bring to this, like at Helpful Places, we're stewarding essentially an open source communication standard for technology, so that we're inspired by how you can go to an airport anywhere in the world, and because of like the wide adoption of symbology, you can understand how to use that space no matter sort of what language that you speak. And I just sort of, the prompting question is like, well, what if that existed for smart cities and the way we sort of navigate these digitally enabled spaces in the present day? So.
And so yeah, if we all agree on the importance and the increasing importance, and we all agree on how we operationalize it and practice it are key. Katrina, can you kind of build on that privacy in practice concept and continue that line of thought of specific examples and processes of incorporating privacy into smarter communities and any model practices that you see on how organizations evaluate or prioritize or do privacy in practice?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's a great discussion, great topic during a fabulous week for privacy. So first of all, I like the question, how can we define a smart city? And I hear that question often. And I think it's an important question to pose because there really isn't one definition for a smart city. It really reflects around the world the priorities and the needs of the inhabitants, the visitors, and also migrants to a city. So if you're in a city, you have expectations and you have needs. And the number of people that are going to be in cities at one given time is increasing dramatically. So if we take a step back and we look around the world and we say, what are the patterns? What are the needs of these growing cities? And truly, they are growing, and there will be demands on the infrastructure. So everything that we need smart power, we need smart transport, we need smart communication systems, we need even smart waste, processes. So there's a lot of needs that we have upon the infrastructure. And my background is that I've looked at smart cities for over a decade, and in Europe, working in the ICT sector and from a sustainability lens. So originally, smart cities started off as how can we cope with rising GHG emissions? How can we cope with the increased demands? And those needs are, as I mentioned, are increasing. And one of the first responses was we have sensors. We have artificial intelligence, and we can have more informed decision-making going on. But with those sensors, they're coming from devices. And from devices, we're inputting oftentimes personal information, or personal information is being captured. And that's where we want to recognize that there is personal information being processed. And not that that's a problem, it just needs to be recognized and protected. That's the key. So in response to your question, it's privacy by design. From the very beginning, from coding to actual launch of products and services, and to also think about cities are not operating in silos. Oftentimes these projects are public-private partnerships. So what do those partnerships agree upon? Do they all agree that there is a need for privacy by design to recognize personal data and to protect it adequately?
Sounds good. And then, a little bit more on that one, Kelsey, if you can kind of weigh back in here. When you talk about privacy by design or implementing privacy in design and implementation of city services or state services or county services, and what would you teach folks to think about and to make sure you do so that you can not only say, I respect the concept, but I've done something that has improved it for our communities?
Yeah, so I love and come to two things first and foremost, and folks who have seen me in other spaces will probably be familiar with this. So I love meaningful, inclusive public engagement. And I think everybody else on this panel can also speak really well to this point, but making sure that what you were building reflects the priorities and the needs of the community is essential. You don't have that, you don't have anything that's going to be sustainable in the long run. And I think we've seen places do lots of interesting, engaging work. This is a place where we're starting to see cities build their capacity, but it's still new and it takes some specialized skills to have a conversation about technical implementations, about privacy and data, and about the potential risks and or benefits of these technologies or these sort of systems that we're thinking about implementing. And so I think making sure that that's baked in from the outset. And it is a key piece of every stage in the project lifecycle. It is sort of my foundational point. But the other tool that I really like, and I know that some folks do or do not agree with me, is privacy impact assessments. I think that having a structured way of thinking about what are the privacy risks and who might they apply to, and are there disparate impacts that we should be considering? And okay, if we've identified those risks, let's think about how likely they are to occur, and let's think about how significant the impact is likely to be so that we can tailor our mitigation strategies appropriately. So we have a sense of prioritization, and that we've gotten these inputs from the community and from our partners and from a variety of stakeholders at every stage in the process. And so I really think that even if it doesn't look exactly the same, if you're not doing the very formal data protection impact assessment required under the GDPR because you're a European city, if you're not doing a surveillance impact report like you might see in cities like Santa Clara or Seattle or Oakland or elsewhere, that just having some sort of process to start to structure how you're thinking about how you're raising the idea of privacy risk and how you're going to address it is a really great way to get people on the same page and start to build that capacity internally to start to flex some of those muscles rather than trying to just outsource the privacy concerns and the privacy solutions outside of government. So those are my two favorite toolbox strategies.
Sounds good. And go ahead, Jigyasa, but I'm going to call on you next, Jackie, because you've seen it internally from the projects, the purchasing, the budget requests, all the way through to now your role as a partner. But Jigyasa, did you want to go first on something that Kelsey had said?
Yeah, I just want to quickly jump in. Yeah, what Kelsey said kind of motivated me to give a few examples. I personally think Oakland and Portland have done an incredible job of coming up with a really well-defined privacy principles and engaging the community in how they think about privacy. And I do want to make one important point, right? When we think about smart communities, in our heads, we are only thinking about the New Yorks, the San Jose's, and the Seattles. We need to understand that there are communities that have resource restrictions. And what I loved about Oakland is that they actually worked with the UC Berkeley Law to come up with their privacy principles, and then the Goldman School to come up with recommendations on how to think about operationalize those principles. So I just want to add in there that use anchor institutes that are in your community to help you think through privacy, especially in cases where you're stretched on resources and you don't have the kind of I would say money and resources to spend on hiring external experts.
Yeah, and Jackie, you come from New York, and New York's almost its own country. But if just for everyone's reference, if we take a look at all the 30,000 cities and counties and states, there's a little less than 30,000 of them. Over 80% of them are less than 60,000 people in population and have city staffs of 300 people or less. Then you have New York. that's like its own animal and country. But when we talk about how we incorporate privacy into a budget proposal, or how we run a project and how we do the public engagement and do those privacy reviews that Kelsey talked about, or even in the procurements and how we incorporate requirements into the relationships and agreements that we set with our vendor community and our partners. You have a lot of experience that crosses boundaries. How would you take on that question of how do you design for and use security in practice when we create these community services?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really salient question when we think about sort of operationalizing some of these principles, because I think one of the challenges that I see, like putting just like the idea of like smart cities and public-private partnerships aside, technology deployment in municipal government is like massively fragmented. It's fragmented at the like operational agency level. So like at the Parks Department, we were sort of deploying our own tools. It's also deployed or there are decisions being made for all agencies at sort of like a citywide level. And I think I also was like the open data coordinator for the Parks Department. And so one of the things that by the time I was leaving sort of New York City public service was starting to sort of come to light was like, well, okay, so open data is great, but how do we think about some of these privacy concerns and who do we even talk to in the city government sort of about that? And at the time, the the New York City formed like their first sort of like chief privacy officer and started to think about that, because the reality was that like corporation counsel, the people working on sort of procurement issues, were just not, they didn't have the skill set to really think through, to look at the terms of service and and all the sort of data provisions, and to be able to evaluate it from that sort of privacy perspective. So the sort of boots on the ground experience I had in the public sector was that everyone was kind of knew that it was a need and knew that they needed to do better, but because technology sort of responsibility for technology and responsibility for these issues in municipal government is largely fragmented, and procurement itself is also fragmented. The question is like, where do you even start to cut in? I think it varies from context to context. And I think that's where tools, the adoption of tools like PIAs and privacy assessments, which I'll just be sort of honest, like was not something that was in like broad practice in New York City government when the time that I served there, would have just even been like a useful reference point to be able to look at, because you know, our corporation counsel just were not even like literate in that. And so like, what can you offer to the public servants that are thinking about these? It's just a way to sort of get started. So I think, so I hope I answered your question. I think so like the TLDR is that we have to really think about how cities like make decisions about technology in general. And there's like so many overlapping bureaucratic and administrative systems that I'd say that like you almost need to be on the inside and an expert to be able to understand how to navigate those seams. So it's not like a great answer, but I think a lot of times when we think about IoT strategies or smart city strategies that start to put these out as principles, that is a starting point. But unless there is sort of a willingness to start to pivot organizational structures to sort of really execute on those mandates, it will sort of remain sort of challenging from locality to locality.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's a fair point, because not every community, like we could pull together an advisory board with the Irina Raikus and the Roxana Marachis and the Bob Lims and the Mike Shapiros, to say, all right, help us, challenge us. We want this to be a strong privacy program. Not every community has that. Almost none do, in fact. So let's kind of flip the script. And this audience is some of the doers, the thinkers, decision makers. It's a good mix. What have you seen that doesn't work? And maybe Katrina, if you can start with that, because you've seen a lot of projects in privacy. And we all know this San Diego example. And San Jose actually turned down an offer of that nature because we couldn't see enough security and privacy there. We just said it wasn't fully baked, so we walked away from a couple opportunities, but we were still interested in the results. We thought it was going to be exciting either way. But Katrina, from your experience.
Okay, the hot seat. Thank you for that. So in preparing for this panel discussion and looking at those examples that we could highlight, or those examples that didn't work, I have to say I did look in my own current backyard of San Diego, but I decided not to focus on this example. I preferred to focus on ones that did. So if you don't mind, I'll say yes, I'm aware. I did follow the recent news reports, and that's an area where I highly would recommend a PIA. And since I've done hundreds of PIAs, I would say let's go for the long form version of the PIA on that one, not the short form. It's already past the threshold part. We'll dive right into the long form. So if I could just maybe take this chance to highlight an example that I found very interesting in preparation for this panel, and that is in Amsterdam. So there's a very interesting example called the Public Eye. And this started a few years ago. It grew out of a crowd monitoring system. And this Public Eye project uses existing cameras plus AI to understand the behavior of crowds. So understand meaning changing of the size, the direction, the density, and the speed. So you can already imagine how important crowd behavior understanding would be. You might have a need for first responders, you might have a public safety need, but you need to understand the behavior of it. What I found interesting about this project is that it wasn't meant to say who's in that crowd. So it wasn't trying to capture images of actual individuals. It was to understand the behavior. So it wasn't to enforce, not to send a ticket, hey, you're in a crowd, now you have a fine. It was to understand, what is the situation? How do we respond? So in taking these images, instead of people, turned it into numbers to create a heat map. And also those images were not saved except for a few, again, with numbers, not individual people, for the purpose of that heat map. And those few images that were saved were on the city-owned encrypted network, okay, and otherwise disposed of. So there's a lot of things going on here. Before that, there was a stakeholder engagement process. So engaging with civil society, engaging with think tank, and acknowledging AI is being used on the Amsterdam City website. You can go on, I went on last night just to verify. More information in Dutch than there is in English, but it's there. And it states, you know, yes, we're using AI for parking, for this, but also for this crowd control project. And I use the word control, but I mean understanding the behavior. That is the purpose. So there's transparency, there's communication, and there's also very important, you asked about themes earlier, purpose. What is the purpose? And sticking with the purpose and having the minimum amount of data to achieve that purpose. And there's attention to the data retention. So there's a lot of things, even the fact that the city owns this net, you know, this city, the data is encrypted on the city-owned network is another area of discussion. Because when you have public-private partnerships, you don't want to have the question, well, I didn't know about that. It's not what I run. It's not what I own. You know, yes, there's a connection there in terms of accountability, another privacy principle. So that example for me just illustrated the significance of having a privacy impact assessment. And so I will leave the one in my own backyard alone for the moment.
And Katrina, I'm going to just call that out as, you know, that's a good example because from your experience, you know a lot of bad examples that you're just a kind person and you're not calling out.
That's right.
Anyone else have, and it's not to criticize, so you could even use like a made up name for like a community Smurf or something. But if there's others, Kelsey, Gyasa, Jackie, where you've seen there's a lesson learned here that we need to apply more broadly, maybe what are a couple of those? Jackie?
Yeah, I mean, I think my experience, and, you know, Rob, you mentioned my work at Sidewalk Labs, you know, that was really challenging, I think, working on the, you know, in a context when these sort of big questions about like, what is the role of technology in our communities are spinning up, and what's the role of technology companies in helping, you know, define what that looks like. And so I would say what doesn't work coming out of that sort of context is that abstract governance structures, those are really sort of challenging. What I learned was that the conversation about privacy has to be very use case, and this is like pulling on, I think, what Katrina was saying, has to be use case driven, has to speak to the specific benefits and outcomes that are expected to sort of come about as a result of the data activity. Sidewalk Labs was sort of famous for proposing the idea of a data trust to try to address some of these sort of multi-stakeholder concerns that could, and it was the idea was that this was an entity that included lots of different types of stakeholders to help make decisions on what could be appropriate uses of data in the development. And it's an idea that like continues to be explored by many institutions around the world. But what we learned was that it wasn't really until we started at Sidewalk articulating those use cases, those benefits of the technology, and also then making deliberate attempts to make those specifics legible. So, you know, like a privacy policy is not legible, people. Like, that's when we could then actually start to have a conversation with regular folks about like, well, what would you want to know about this in order to be able to be curious, to be able to be willing to explore what that works. And I think what came out of that learning, as I had mentioned previously, and maybe we can show the slide that I had wanted to show. I'll also pop the link into the chat for everyone. Oops, sorry, Zoom just did a thing for me. We started to think about like, well, what does that increased legibility look like? And so this open, so you can imagine this is basically a pilot that we did. I did after I left Sidewalk with the city of Boston, that shows like, well, what if we started communicating purpose and accountability and specifics about the data processing to people? And so in this pilot, you can imagine how you're coming up to this intersection. Here, there was a computer vision camera that was processing data, on device. And you could actually be like, oh, okay, this is being used for planning. There's something going on here. The city of Boston is accountable. And you can scan this QR code to learn more. And so actually that QR code does work if people wanted to take their phones out and scan it. But it's the key practice, I think, that comes out of that learning is like, how are you being deliberate in making the information legible? And how are you creating an invitation to people that is actually a dialogue on the sort of feedback loop? So if you scan that QR code, you'll see that there's like a place to ask questions and a place for those questions to be answered. So I think it's like, what are some, this basically like how does design and thinking about interaction design, how can that help us think about host these conversations and invite the questions from the community, not sort of presenting the use of technology as just like a fait accompli, but framing, the sort of notice and legibility as a way to actually encourage that civic conversation. And it's not so hopefully that's like both what didn't work and one possible idea about how we could start to address that. So
yeah, and community comfort level shifts over time based on what's in the news and what people learn. Two questions, one for you, Jigyasa, and one for you, Kelsey. So Kelsey, on some of this, public retention laws might even get in the way in some places where we don't want to retain as long as we do if it's like a public camera. Can I write down a note here that you'll fix that for us through some kind of proposed legislation?
Absolutely. I will say that's number 2 when my magic wand kicks in next week or on the actual 28th. The first one, though, is actually going to be those public records laws. Those are the ones that keep me up at night. Those are also, we've got some tension between transparency and privacy, shining a light on government, but not on the people whose data the government has, is something we're still trying to work out. And the retention periods are a big part of that as well. So.
Gotcha. And any specific example where there's a key lesson learned in how government balances its transparency and retention role with protecting people's trust in that we're using their data responsibly?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about this in the context of things like open data plans. I think a lot about this in the context of places where those public records laws aren't very strong on privacy, in states like mine in Washington and some other places. And I think part of it comes down to that being really clear about what the values are of what we're trying to collect and use the data for. And what do we think that the uses of that will be? Like, how do we think that will benefit people and potentially put them at risk? And how do we have the conversation about that? But I do think that it comes down to recognizing, right, knowledge is power. And we need to make sure that the goals of the public records laws, the goals of the open data programs, is to shine a light on government. And it just so happens that sometimes it's a lot easier for government, rather than show sometimes places where it might be embarrassed or where the data is incomplete, to just hand over the data of the public that it has. It's probably really well organized because that's the data it uses day to day. So I think the bigger arching, I see a lot, sort of the metaphor that I really like in this space is people looking for their keys under the streetlight and not where they dropped them, down the road. And I think that is like the fundamental challenge that I have with government data and technology, is sometimes the easy path isn't actually the one that's going to get you to the result that you were trying to. And I think that's part of that balance between privacy, transparency, and a lot of our other fundamental values. But I just want to say, just to the prior question on like, what's the one thing that people get wrong? I think it's just if you ignore privacy, if you try to put your head in the sand and you get defensive about it, or you try to pretend that people aren't concerned for legitimate reasons, that's the one fatal flaw. That's going to sink your project every time. So That's my soapbox.
That makes sense. And Giagas, I'm going to apologize. I'm realizing what time it is. We have about 6 minutes left in our session. So I'm going to accelerate kind of through two things. And Kelsey, I'm going to keep going with you. Is one of the things that we're really concerned about is a lot of these technologies have kind of black box type uses inside, where they take algorithms, we feed it data, and it tells us what we should do. And the things we discover are it absorbs biases. It has no tool to tweak for equity. And we're really concerned, even though there's great efficiencies that could benefit us in some of these applications, as a tool, it has a fatal flaw in some significant ways, unless we can have some light on it and ability to catch and tweak for it. From kind of your perspective, and it's more future focused, algorithmic bias, what should we do?
Ooh, I know that there are a lot of people actively working on this in California and elsewhere, local, state, federal, international. I'm really excited that this is a conversation that we're having in a much more active way than we were 10 years ago. I think the focus needs to be for local government specifically, bringing in developing that expertise in-house, facing these challenges and recognizing our limitations, but realizing that we need to build up staff capacity to make sure that people are buying technologies that they understand before they roll them out. And sometimes that means that the people are buying algorithms or AI systems that do much more than they think they do. Sometimes it's much less than they think they do. And we want to make sure that we're right-sizing that and we're using our resources appropriately. We also need to make sure that our staff aren't setting aside their own judgment and oversight, that they sort of fall prey to this black box magic of it spits out numbers and I'm not really sure where they came from, but to empower people to dig deeper and to look for potential disparate impacts, to try to understand and engage with the community about the ways that these things might have unintended consequences. And I think part of that, the lesson that I always try to stress to folks in local governments is that I completely understand the desire to put tools in place where there's the greatest need. But that tends to be where we have the most vulnerable populations. So children, schools, prison systems, people on public benefits, where if you get it wrong, the consequences will be enormously impactful. And so we need to not test out new systems on those populations. We need to find safer environments to make sure that we're getting, we're running into whatever those potential unintended consequences are in a way that's not going to put people's lives and livelihoods at risk. So I think resourcing up, being thoughtful about where we deploy and what the potential use cases are is sort of my focus on these ones. Awesome.
And so last question, I'm going to put it out there and then say some things to give people some time to kind of come up with a couple pithy statements. But one line or two, what people operationally, tactically, at a strategic policy level need to do to make sure that privacy is respected and acted on. And I'll say a couple of things while you think about that. And I want to recognize Team JK here, what amazing people. And I think it also demonstrates how powerful the leadership of women in technology and data are, that you see this group who's talking with us. But with that, one line from each of you about what the audience should do at a day-to-day level and just long-term to make sure that privacy is part of our work. And let me start with you, Giagas.
Yeah, so I had a very elaborate answer to this question, but I'm going to try to stick to 1 minute. But I have this theory about some narrative traps that often smart communities fall for. And the biggest one, I believe, is the trap where people say data is an asset. I don't think so. I think, in fact, it's a liability if not used responsibly and ethically. People and your community are your biggest assets, so make sure you keep them at the forefront of your decisions as you think through your smart city projects.
All right. Katrina, you want to go next?
Yes, first I'd like to say I love the energy of this panel. Great comments from everyone. Thank you. So my comments very succinct. Number one, for everyone, think about what is personal data? What is it? It's a lot more than we think. And encourage people around you. Do you know what personal data is? If it relates back to you, a natural person, it's has a high chance of being personal data. Second, purpose. Why? Simple. We have a lot of principles. We have a lot of things to think about, but those two questions, what is personal data and why is it needed?
Thank you. Jackie or Kelsey, whoever unmutes first.
I guess that would make me. I would say, what is the problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah.
get really crisp about that. Remove data, remove technology, and understand who you're trying to solve the problem for, and figure out if there's actually like a structural issue causing the problem, that is possibly actually a place to start. That's probably like the, and then you may then end up finding yourself going down the path of technology and data, but that's not where you start.
All right, Kelsey, take us home.
I love all of the things that everybody else has said. These are amazing. I will add my 2 cents are for governments, invest. You need budget and resources and staff, and you just need to recognize that this is happening and that it's not going to go away, that privacy infrastructure is going to be the key to innovation going forward. It's part of the air that we breathe these days. And for people who are in the community looking around saying, I'm worried about these problems, mobilize, volunteer your time, your energy, your expertise, and your perspective to your local government, who I'm sure are facing many of these same questions and trying to figure it out and could definitely value and benefit from your perspective.
All right, rock on. Thank you, everyone. Yale, back over to you at exactly 11:45.
Wow, right on time. Thank you so much for that wonderful discussion, and being on time is always appreciated. So thanks everybody for being able to compress the remarks that you made into the relatively brief time that we had. If any panelists that are still on want to come back, we have time for a couple of questions that the audience posed in the Q&A that I think can take up a few minutes here before we make some final closing remarks. One relates to what Kelsey mentioned earlier, a phrase that I really like: meaningful, inclusive public engagement. And one of the questions is, how can we help community members to learn more about and offer into smart community efforts? So, those are really kind of related. We've talked a lot about the idea of impact assessments and, work being done on the side, perhaps on the inside with whatever the local government is attempting to do. But, have any of you seen examples or, have thoughts about how that meaningful public engagement can actually take place so that the members of the community can provide input into the implementation of smart efforts? So Kelsey, maybe I'll call on you since I was using your very eloquent term to describe, and if anybody else wants to chime in, please feel free.
Yeah, so I'll start, but I think I saw Jigasa's hand go up as well. I'll just to shine a light on some folks that I think have been doing a really good job. Involve cities like Portland, Oregon, who have been doing a fantastic job of doing public engagement and meeting community members where they are, reaching out to that groups that already exist and are active and interested in these issues, bringing in new voices to the conversation, doing cafes and world cafes and conferences, and trying to do things that are ground up rather than sort of the city talking down to people. I think really appreciated and have been trying to steal from Long Beach, California's digital equity survey, and reaching out to community members through art and oral engagement, and not just here's a paper survey in a digital environment, and trying to recognize again some of the accessibility challenges and trying to be inclusive and reach out to folks who might not be part of the conversation in the past. And I really like situations and examples from things like the Area of Things, where they were working with local high schools and sharing the data back to the community and helping build the talent and skills of these devices. And I think a really collaborative, bidimensional way. So just to shine a light on a couple of I think really great examples.
Great, thanks. Jigyasa, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of my most favorite quotes when it comes to community engagement and equity is if you're not on the table, you're on the menu, right? So it's extremely important to think about, just start with your sort of stakeholder mapping and understand who are the different groups that you're working with. who needs to be on the table, because there can be substantial harms from exclusion itself that could lead to loss of privacy. So thinking about who are your stakeholders, who do you need to engage with, and then going from there with a strategy on how to involve those different groups, I think that's something that is needed. I do want to point out to my favorite resource on by our data bodies, and it's a pretty interesting playbook. It comes along with facilitation guides and how to educate the community about data and how data gets collected, and just to educate, because I think I think local governments need to step up and not just do the right thing, but also do it right in terms of also trying to educate the community. And I think it's the responsibility of the local government to do that. And I think resources like these come in handy for that. So yeah, that's my bit.
And Rob, it looks like you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, just maybe 3 comments. One is the Center for Digital Government actually has created a library of principles, policies, job descriptions, the work from many. And there are great partnerships out there, number 2, to join. People like we see on this panel are very giving of their time and want to be a part of a community of practice and form something that makes an impact. So there are some groups that you can join and be a part of. But number 3 is that engagement piece and just making it a priority. Nothing says it's important quite like the organization saying we are dedicating to some principles, we are honoring a process. And in government, we have 3 levers that are always where we incorporate, right? When we ask money, that is a moral document, the city's budget. And if privacy is there, then it is a value. In our project execution, when we approve those projects, that privacy is incorporated into those. And then when we purchase things, it's a mechanism too. And the last thing I'll remind folks is, if you take a look at our infrastructure, it is an equity artifact. It says who's mattered and where for decades. And in the future, we're going to see some privacy investments that we should have made back then. And our job is to try to be as prescient and responsible as possible. But there are other people here that we all get to work with that are pretty amazing and brilliant.
Thank you. Those are really helpful, because we got some specific examples and also, some concepts to consider. There has been a lot of discussion today about the idea of procurement. So appreciate Rob's comments in terms of things like budget and interacting with vendors. One other set of questions that has come in is actually on the more technical side of things. Right now the hot topic is Web 3.0, not expecting anybody to actually know what that means, but decentralization is an essential kind of concept in that term. And then there are other technologies like differential privacy, ways where you can help to try to protect personal information using technical means. Have folks seen those deployed in the context of smart cities in a way that might help address some of the concerns that have been raised in these panels? And Aaron, it looks like you have your hand up.
I thought the Web 3.0 question was really interesting. And to answer your last question, no, I haven't seen it deployed yet in ways that are relevant, I don't think, in smart cities. But it is a technology that is, in theory, really transforms how we think about privacy, right? Like in the way that that sort of Web 2.0 has detached our digital presence from our physical presence. Like physical address doesn't mean the same kind of thing as it used to. I think the underlying theory of Web 3, which includes blockchain and NFTs and cryptocurrency and decentralized organizations and things, is to detach your identity from specific platform-bound login addresses, right? So like just having everything attached to your Gmail address or your Facebook login, which is kind of how we access the web now. So I don't have more to add than that. We don't have much time, but I think it is an interesting, a particularly interesting technology for the privacy conversation.
Any other hands? Anybody else want to jump in on that one? Okay, so we just have a few minutes left here. I think I'm going to go ahead and say thank you to all our panelists. Bring our event today to a close, and just wanted to offer a few remarks. There were some very complex and important issues that were raised in the panels today. I think one thing that I thought was really interesting was just some recognition that the idea of a smart city or a smart community has some inherently political elements to it. That you have to think beyond just the idea of sort of adding technology to existing infrastructure or using technology to solve problems, but you have to go beyond that and think about whose problems are being solved, what are the identities of the folks within the community whose issues are trying to be addressed, and those need to be kept top of mind, as communities want to add technology to try to address some of the problems that they face. The other interesting element, particularly in the first panel that came up repeatedly, was the idea of vendors and the private sector being involved in the implementation of smart community efforts. And there's certainly a natural partnership there, given that so much of these efforts rely on technology and that the private sector is developing them. That's where some of these questions that were brought up in the second panel regarding procurement, the infrastructure within local governments and how those kinds of relationships are managed is really important. And I really appreciate several members of the panels kind of highlighting the jurisdictions that they're familiar with that have invested within their particular cities or counties in some kind of privacy office or privacy staff that can help to kind of think about these issues in a holistic manner. As the panelists highlighted, smart communities offer a great deal of promise for improving services to and the experiences of their constituents. But at the same time, the volume of data required to connect communities with sensors, wireless communications, and data analytics raises important questions about how that data is treated. Today, we've heard from two great panels of experts exploring how to strike that balance. And on that note, I want to take a moment to offer our sincere thanks to our moderators, Aaron Deacon and Rob Lloyd, as well as all of our panelists who took the time to offer their insight today. So on behalf of the County of Santa Clara Privacy Office and the Office of County Supervisor Joe Simitian, I hope that everyone has enjoyed this event today. We have a short anonymous survey that we're going to be posting in the chat. So please, for any attendees, we would really appreciate it if you fill that out. And I want to give a special thanks to all of those who contributed to Data Privacy Day this year. We look forward to having all of you join us next year for what will be our 5th iteration of this event. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.